Okay, so today's lecture is going to be about this theme of the course, which is the theme of enlightenment. I will focus in the lecture on two of your authors, two of the texts that you will be looking at, Immanuel Kant and Condorcet. And I have to tell you from the beginning that the topic of enlightenment is a highly controversial one. So, it's controversial because enlightenment has been held responsible for a variety of things, for often contradictory political projects, for totalitarianism, for the manipulation and objectification of nature, for European imperialism and colonization, for both liberalism and fascism, as well as for the most aggressive aspects of capitalism. So there's a general sentiment in our contemporary world of an anti-Enlightenment sentiment. So the stakes are quite high for how we interpret the Enlightenment, because clearly as an intellectual and social phenomenon, it is seen to have introduced what one could call dangerous new forms of thought that threaten the basic structures of authority, tradition, faith and privilege on which the Ancien Regime society rested. So the Enlightenment of reason, as you may call it, had the main aim of destroying prejudice and asserting the human as a rational animal. Arguably, however, it has probably underestimated the strength of certain prejudices, both religious and social, and perhaps failed to realize how old prejudices are easily replaced by new ones. So Enlightenment has been, in a sense, submitted to many rejections and accusations, the cost of which has been a general abandonment of its ideals of freedom and universality. So the most essential formulation or proposition in Enlightenment thought, one that we already saw taking seed in Rousseau's writings last week, is that history itself is not an impersonal force that somewhat realizes itself in the world, but that is a product of man's action and activity. So for Enlightenment thought, what is most precious in history is the signs of progress, or man's progress, or human progress, or the progressive liberation of the human spirit, its fight and struggle against the forces which oppress and have oppressed it. In other words, the 18th century, or the Enlightenment sphere, not only sought to explain the world and its propositions, but also to transform the world by explaining it. Condorcet, who you will read in this section of the course, somewhat optimistically believed, too optimistically, because his text that you will read was written while he was in exile and on the run from the very revolution, from the very French Revolution that he was a philosophe of or an ideologue of. But he optimistically believed that progress is by no means inevitable and fatal, but that the history of humanity somewhat shows that it is real. The question that Condorcet, of course, asked is it not reasonable to admit that humanity, which has known how to conquer spiritual liberty, scientific truth, and political liberty with the French Revolution, will somewhat not repudiate its conquests and will not abandon the enlightening power of reason? Condorcet, in his essay or sketch for the history of progress, outlines 10 successive epochs of human history's advance from brute simplicity to somewhat scientific enlightenment. According to him, it was Descartes, whom you've already engaged with, who closed the 8th epoch, which extends from, for Condorcet, the invention of the printing to the time when science and philosophy shook off the yoke of authority. Then the 9th epoch extends from Descartes until the founding of the French Republic after the French Revolution. And the 10th epoch, which is the epoch to come, covers the future progress of the human mind, according to Condorcet. So the aim of his sketch, which you will be reading this week, was to provide an account or a history of the necessary ideas for maintaining a democratic and republican faith, one that he professed and as well was kind of the spirit of the 18th century. The two great events for Condorcet were the American and French Revolution, which symbolized the triumph of, again, philosophy over prejudice, liberty over despotism. Ultimately, Condorcet expressed a specific spirit of enlightenment, and that's why you will be reading him as a representative also of this time, which was the commitment to the future in the 10th epoch, a faith in progress, the preponderance of the future over the past, of action over inheritance, and reason over tradition. So for Condorcet, the French Revolution had to be or had succeeded in becoming a radical revolution. Okay, it was highly optimistic at this moment. And it is this very radicalism which gives it its decisive importance in the history of humanity for him. It concludes the history of liberation and initiates that of what you will call the epoch of liberty. So in and by the French Revolution, humanity or reason acquired its full possession of itself somewhat for Condorcet. Henceforth, man becomes a master of himself, of his actions, and of his future. Of the future he will select and determine for himself by his own reflective, conscious behavior. It is because of this that the 10th epoch for Condorcet, it is in the 10th epoch only that humanity will come into a time when it will consciously pursue progress. And this is an idea, of course, that you can see resonating in some of Rousseau's writings from last week, this kind of notion of the perfectibility of man, of the human, right? Rousseau's idea that given that the social contract is contrived, is created, that there is absolutely no way back to a state of nature, then now we must think of this coming into this social contract as somewhat a way of self-transformation, a reconstitution of a new social individual, right? And this is an idea that Condorcet as well shared. So Condorcet in his text proceeds to stress the importance of public instruction, of education, the importance of building public institutions to safeguard the legacy of the revolution. And instead of thinking about the Constitution as a sacred text, so rather than a text that you would take as a sacred one, Condorcet proposed that it is only permanent institutions that can be established as the guardians of society. So in a sense, for him, and here we're talking about public education systems, we're talking about these kinds of institutions that he was interested in conceiving. So for Condorcet, the past does not dominate the present, and the present does not command the future. No one has the right to legislate for the future. Hence his plan, or what he tried to formulate as this, what was called the Girondist constitution that was completely refuted at the time, which would technically have turned France into a society of permanent debate. Okay, this was completely rejected, and after which he was fleeing death and writing and hiding. So he had this idea of institution building versus constitution writing. Okay, even in the way he formulated an idea of the law. So this said about Condorcet, we will see, or what I want to try and say is that the Enlightenment that you are going to be looking at in your reading selections was already somewhat a project that was originally split into two camps. One would be a radical camp, a radical Enlightenment camp, which insisted on the separation of faith and reason, in which you could place Rousseau, Condorcet, and Kant, perhaps in line with Spinoza, Diderot, and others, and a more moderate or conservative camp, which attempted to reconcile them in support of a modernized monarchy or ecclesiastical authority, in which one could perhaps place Hobbes, Locke, Bacon, Voltaire, Montaigne, and Hume. So the midwife of this supposed radical Enlightenment in which I'm placing Kant and Condorcet in essentially came from philosophy, or in what is called l'esprit philosophique. Philosophy provided the pamphleteers, journalists, elected deputies of both the American, French, Dutch, Italian, and other revolutions of 1770, 1780, and 1790, with slogans and maxims and ideologies to justify this fundamental break with the past. And it was in turn, this philosophical spirit, affected by these social transformations. So the overthrow of altar, throne, and nobility was the aim that could only stem from the transformation in people's ways of thinking. So in a sense, the Enlightenment posited a fundamental link between revolution of the mind, of thought and thinking, and political revolution, and hence posited this idea of intellectual discovery, constant intellectual discovery as what needs to be affirmed as a salutary pursuit rather than as some kind of calamitous act. So it's important to note that the Enlightenment universals were essentially premised on fissures or on breaks and splits. As you already saw with Descartes, thought is possible through radical doubt. Cogito and madness are somewhat intertwined. Descartes' obsession with how can he tell a difference between hallucinating and thinking. Rationality can only be practiced through a recognition of its very limits with Kant, as we will see today. Freedom and autonomy as well can only be achieved through a heteronymous act of recognizing the law as what is external to the self. So this is where the categorical imperative, which you will as well probably discuss, comes as this kind of recognition of a law or a standard that is somewhat external to the self. The subject is only human in Enlightenment thinking because of language, which in turn proves impossible to turn into science, a matter that figures ranging from Condillac to Herder to Diderot we're considering. And ironically, the Enlightenment that proposes itself as the rebirth of humankind closes with Hegel's declarations of the end of history, the end of philosophy, and the end of art. So even though the Enlightenment was a European phenomenon, it should not be reduced to a claim for the superiority and integrity of European values. Rather, in a sense, Enlightenment is not reducible to any identity position, Western, European, or other. It is not reducible to any subjective position. It's precisely about, and we will see today with Kant, relating negatively to oneself for the purpose of an openness to all others. So in this sense, the Enlightenment spirit posits a certain cut, an irreducible divide within particular positions. It is, as Kant will tell us in this shortly, about the participation in a universal ethico-political principle that is accessible to everyone. In other words, it is a demand for universality and a transcendence of particularities. So one can venture to say that somewhat Enlightenment is about accepting homelessness as the truest of fates. Some of the key figures of Enlightenment thought emerge from within the German context in Europe, but are influenced by the French and American revolutions. In the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe witnessed the rise of a modern bourgeois society, which, although released man from the fetters of feudalism, chained him into an image of the natural and social worlds as machines, as a machine made of parts, and in which the individual served as a cog in the machine. So this naturalization of a mechanical understanding of the world, which you already saw exemplified in Francis Bacon's work that you have read, and the fixed laws that were revealed to govern the solar system since Copernicus, once projected onto human society, in the idea of the Leviathan that you've already been exposed to, the Hobbesian and Lockean social contracts, and perhaps Smithian political economy or Adam Smith's political economy, this kind of mechanistic understanding of the world and its projection onto human society proves to be highly problematic. Kant describes this mechanization of the social world as a state in which immaturity has become natural to man, or the word that he uses is dotage, as the original translation of the word, in which only rules and formulas epitomize the use of reason and suppress its potentials to free man. This does not mean, however, that Kant did not recognize the real, somewhat machine-like attributes of man. We are indeed finite beings who are not essentially free, but bound into a chain of causal determination or a nexus of cause and effect, having no autonomy and perhaps being simply thinking machines. But the question for Kant was, what do we do with this knowledge of our own finitude, our own machine-like existence? In a manner perhaps similar to Descartes, again, whom you've already been exposed to in the course, the finite being here is limited, but reason is infinite, because its limits are somewhat internal to itself. These are not empirical limits. So reason is somewhat theoretically infinite. It is an a priori to empirical knowledge. Recognizing the limits of reason for Kant is to be understood as the limiting of what you would call pure speculation that has no self-guiding structure. So a quote from Kant, because, however, human reason always strives for freedom, when it breaks its fetters, the first use it makes of its long unaccustomed freedom has to degenerate into a misuse and a presumptuous trust of its faculties from all limitations, leading to the persuasion of the sole authority of speculative reason, which assumes nothing except what it can justify by objective grounds and dogmatic conviction. Then Enlightenment, in a sense, is posited as a specific stance, or a specific stance of critique, we might say, one that demands that we think for ourselves, even if it means thinking against ourselves, against what we naturally take to be constitutive of our very own subjectivities. Again, a quote from Kant, thinking for oneself means seeking the supreme touchstone of truth in oneself, i.e. in one's own reason. And the maxims of always thinking for oneself is enlightenment. To make use of one's reason means no more than to ask oneself, whenever one is supposed to assume something, whether one could find it feasible to make the ground or rule in which one assumes it into a universal principle for the use of reason. So in a sense, this legacy of enlightenment, or this kind of enlightenment spirit, can be precisely summed up best in Kant's own words. Enlightenment is the exit from self-incurred immaturity, from the inability to speak for oneself, to that of autonomous self-determination. So the word Unmündigkeit that Kant uses, the specific word that he uses, can somewhat be translated to mean, or is derived from Mund, from mouth, from a certain sense of mouthliness. Mündigkeit means that you're entitled or able to use your own mouth as you wish, meaning you're able to speak and be a full citizen, also somewhat in the legal sense, in terms of maturity. So in response to this question, what is enlightenment, and the increasingly pressing questions of the 18th century concerning the nature of political authority and the question of human freedom, Kant made a proposition for what enlightenment should or ought to mean, and not with a proposition for what enlightenment somewhat already is. So this ought to be rather than what is. Enlightenment, as he proposed in the text you are going to be reading, points somewhat like a vector to a path of continuous intellectual pursuit despite all obstacles and in recognition of them. It is somewhat a trajectory of, one could say, purposeless purposiveness. So if I'm indeed a thinking machine, as Kant tells us, if I'm indeed an automaton, then that may be perhaps my only grounds for freedom. So this emptying, and here I want to try to kind of give you an example and maybe a way to think about this. This emptying out of the human person of kind of all substantial content is precisely where the subject somewhat emerges for Kant. In other words, the transcendental subject is not a person. It is somewhat a pure subject, a doll-like thing which speaks. Think of the emergence of the Enlightenment figures of monsters, of Frankenstein in specific. Is it not curious that in the moment in which Enlightenment thought obsessed with the relationship between nature and culture, that we see the emergence of such monsters? Frankie, or Frankenstein, somehow came to embody this kind of missing link between nature and culture. So when Enlightenment sought to produce a man or a woman of culture that could somehow conserve an unspoiled nature, the monster emerges. The monster emerges at the moment of emergence of the knowing subject, precisely because of the ambiguity of the questions of origins of language, of society, of culture. Now, the tragedy of the monster, who's excluded, who ends up being excluded from both nature and culture alike, but whose monstrosity remains to be the monstrosity of culture, the noble savage, the self-educated man, turns into a monster because society essentially rejects him. He's not offered a social contract and ends up destroying everyone around him, including himself. In a way, the Kantian subject is this kind of Frankensteinian monster. If only it could exist, then it would amend the great chain of being, fill the break between matter and spirit, nature and culture. But when we cover this lack, this gap between the two, all we get is horror, but somewhat a kind of a touching horror. Frankenstein has a positive aspect. He's not a catastrophic result of enlightenment, but the possibility of another nature, a sublime nature that gets lost in the mechanical, clockwork-like universe, a nature that could get this kind of reaction, perhaps. But the video, this is from the young Francis. I'm sorry, the sound is not working, so it doesn't have its effect as such, but it's not my fault. So Frankenstein has this kind of positive aspect. He's not the catastrophic result of enlightenment, but the possibility of another nature, a sublime nature that gets lost in the mechanical clockwork-like universe. He can only be present through the effort to represent the unrepresentable, or what is somewhat lost from the scientific endeavor. So the uncanniness of Frankenstein and other Enlightenment monsters speaks of the limits of enlightenments and the limits of interpretation for Kant's subject or his transcendental subject as he calls it in the Critique of Pure Reason, precisely a no thing, or a point of what he calls apperceptive unity, that we must presuppose in order to explain how perceptions can be unified into intelligible knowledge claims about the world. This apperceptive unity, however, cannot itself be known like the things that it knows. It's always subject to a gaze from elsewhere. Think of Frankenstein and how he can never somewhat endure an image of himself in the mirror. So after this kind of digression into monsters as the expressions of the limits of enlightenment, we can get closer a bit to the text itself. So the importance of reading a figure like Kant today, and especially with this text, is in understanding the text as an ethical and pedagogical exposition. So the question, what is enlightenment, was initially put forth by a theologian and educational reformer in 1783, while questioning the advisability of civil marriage ceremonies in Germany. This theologian Zollner received responses in the newspapers from Moses Mendelssohn and Immanuel Kant and multiple other figures. The debate in the newspaper centered on the issue of how much enlightenment of the citizenry was possible or desirable, and at what cost. It lasted for more than 10 years in the press, and by the time that Louis XVI was executed after the outbreak of the French Revolution, the question of enlightenment became intertwined with whether enlightenment undermined public authority and necessarily led to political turmoil. So it's important to clarify first that Kant's response in the text, What is Enlightenment?, was in no way posed in a reflexive manner. So he wasn't simply reflecting on the question in his response. He wasn't making a usual argument that is quite salient in our world, that knowledge is a reflective act that simply sheds light on the world, making it more visible to sight. Rather, for Kant, knowing is not simply about seeing, but about speaking, in a sense, without fear, without self-incurred cowardice and immaturity. And this is precisely what he was doing as a philosopher from his home in Königsberg. He wrote a journalistic essay meant for the newspapers and the public, and in a sense acted as somewhat a public intellectual himself. He spoke actively in the world rather than remaining bound to the position of a scholar in a closed, bounded academy. So in a sense, he put to use this kind of what he would call the public use of reason. So although enlightenment as a word bears the meaning of illumination, or carries the meaning of light, in the text that you will be reading, Kant does not invoke images of light. Instead, what he invokes are images of speech and discourse as what are the most essential elements of enlightenment. So what is being demanded in this specific invocation is not simply a world in which everything stands naked in the light of knowledge, but one in which it is possible to speak without fear. So the question is always, what can I know? And this question of what can I know does not involve seeing. Like scientific knowledge does not only involve empirical observation, knowing is also not some form of like inner light either. Its most important aspect is that it involves language, speaking or discourse with and for others. Now, speaking and seeing are two different acts in the world. Free speech for Kant, as we will see, is not about simply being free to have an opinion, but about being free to use one's understanding. And this is premised on the following steps: to think for oneself, to think from the standpoint of everyone else, and to think always consistently. So only by being proficient at the first two can we be proficient at the third. So we can only think freely if we think for ourselves in the company of others, and this is not a matter of formulating opinions, but judgments. Thus, Kant does not adhere to the idea of introspection as a mode of thought. An analogy that could perhaps clarify this better is philosophical thought that was rooted in reflection is best conceived of in terms of a process of mirroring, by which knowledge is understood as a secondary representation of being, and being is seen to exist in itself. Although knowledge simply understood as a mirror provides the subject with an image from the perspective of another, there's still a complicity of one's own viewpoint. You can now, for example, look at yourself in the mirror any way you like. You can also see this in the modern photograph, where you have this kind of pronounced uncanniness, this pronounced parallax. When you first look at a photograph or a mirror image of yourself, there's this kind of sense of unease. And this sense of unease that's generated from the reflective posture can somewhat be said to be based on a certain optical delusion. So Kant's critical gesture is that he believed that the past and perhaps future methods of philosophy that were premised on reflection were only optical delusions. And this is a quote from Kant. "Formerly, I viewed human common sense only from the standpoint of my own. Now I put myself into the position of another's reason outside of myself and observe my judgments together with their most secret causes from the point of view of others. It is true that the comparison of both observations results in pronounced parallax, but it is the only means of preserving the optical delusion and of putting the concept of the power of knowledge in human nature into its true place." So here, what is being suggested is not this kind of platitude that one should see things not only from one's own point of view, but also from the point of view of others. But the question is how to face a reality exposed through parallax, through difference. So if one's subjective view is an optical delusion, then the objective perspective or the viewpoint of others cannot but be an optical delusion as well. And if the history of philosophy is nothing but the history of such reflections, then the history of philosophy is itself nothing but optical delusion. This means thinking isn't simply an act from a place between two poles, but instead it is this parallax between positions that acts. Kant performed this kind of critical oscillation. He continuously confronted the dominant rationalism with empiricism and the dominant empiricism with rationalism. So the Kantian critique, is the movement of this critique, exists precisely in this irreducibility to a stable third position. It's always this movement of transversal and transpositional shifts. So in a sense, a reflection as a metaphor can indeed make us aware of things like tradition, religion, family, society, and the state, but it can never provide the grounds for a release from them. So it is only critique as a speech act and not as an introspective thought that is the sole method of enlightenment. Critique as a process of questioning what is and taking a stance from it. Of course, a range of thinkers after Kant have argued that Kant's idea of critique is simply impossible, that it is impossible to step out from one's own traditions, from what are the main constitutive factors of the subject. Stepping out of one's own traditions for these critics of Kant would be like stepping out of one's language and stepping out of one's self. In a sense, what some have considered a mere impossibility, Kant posits as the very condition of enlightenment. So I'll skip through some things. So Kant's enlightenment is, in a sense, not reducible to a stage of development of European civilization, but about the gesture of executing this critique from a place beyond the given binaries of any situation. In fact, we are compromised in reading Kant's text from the present when we reduce it to a teleology of progress. It's important, however, for us to be honest about the failure of Kant's predictions for society. Even in his own age, he recognized the lack of an age of enlightenment. Recall in the text, or you will see in the text that you will read, Kant's words, "Do we now live in an enlightened age?" The answer is no, but we do live in an age of enlightenment. So there must be enlightened people for the age to be called an age of enlightenment. Even a revolution for Kant does not guarantee the true reforms of a way of thinking, for it can bring down aristocratic despotism or oppression, but may not be able to overcome the inclinations towards cowardice and immaturity. So if we go to the very first sentence in the text, this exit from self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to make use of one's understanding without the guidance of another. So this immaturity is self-incurred not because it is a lack of understanding, but because it is caused by a lack of courage and resolution to use one's understanding. So by claiming that this immaturity is self-incurred, Kant located the source of the problem within the self. In order to exit the state of immaturity, one must be able to carry out a process of an ethical critique of the self. One must overcome social restrictions and processes of individuation. The ethical has to become a process of reconstitution of the self. So there's no excuse for Kant in saying that someone has put you in a condition of immaturity. He writes in the introductory paragraph, "It is so easy to be immature." So moving on in the text, Kant claims that it is formal academic education, the university, religion, and ideology that actively fend off maturity and make subjects fear it. The figures of the pastor, the scholarly book, and the doctor are singled out by him as guardians who speak for the subject, as guardians who perpetuate a state of immaturity. And this is Kant. I have a book that has understanding for me, a pastor who has a conscience for me, a doctor who judges my diet for me, and so forth. Surely I do not need to trouble myself. I have no need to think, if only I can pay, others will take over the tedious business for me. Those guardians who have graciously taken up the oversight of mankind take care that the far greater part of mankind, including the entire fairer sex, regard the step to maturity as not only difficult, but also as very dangerous. Thus, immaturity had come to be considered the natural state of the subject, their understanding tethered to a ruse of mechanical and instrumental logic, like domestic animals tethered to carts, guided by them. So this path of exit from immaturity, as being proposed, is only treaded at somewhat a very high cost by a mere few. It's almost a suicidal act. In other words, the cost of enlightenment is high, one that may not be one that many will be willing to bear. However, Kant claimed that true public enlightenment would only happen gradually, through the gradual reforms of the ways of thinking in a society. So even the overthrow of a monarch or an absolutist rule through a revolution would not be enough for enlightenment, because tyrannical power lies in society, in the very structures of our very thought. So, and this is, again, a quote from him, a revolution may perhaps bring about the fall of an autocratic despotism and of an avaricious or overbearing oppression, but it can never bring about the true reform of a way of thinking. Rather, new prejudices will serve, like the old, as the leading strings of the thoughtless masses. So after he makes this above argument, Kant presents us with the true factor of enlightenment, the freedom to make a public use of one's reason in all matters. So this is certainly one of Kant's most famous and differently interpreted statements. Liberals, on the one hand, have made it into an argument for the separation of rights and duties in the social contract. It has been interpreted as an argument about the separation of legality and morality. It has also been interpreted as an excuse for asserting reason over rationality, i.e. as in West over other cultures. However, if we look at Kant's text closely, if we read the text closely, we would reach entirely different and contradictory conclusions. If enlightenment has to do with the reform of a way of thinking, as has already been stated, and not in replacements of forms of representative powers in society with others, then enlightenment does not mean the further separation of the private from the public, but an overcoming of the private, of individual inclinations for something that is external to the self, outside it even, or foreign from it even. So nothing is required for enlightenment besides freedom, as Kant says, the freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. Social and political institutions do not cease to command the subject to obey. We have already a list of the state, the church, the Prussian king. They all command one to obey, and indeed one can obey. But in order to be free, the subject must undertake an act that shifts them from the particular conditions of their subjugation to a somewhat universal realm of reason. So the public use of reason does not simply oppose the individual to their particular surrounding community, but opposes particular communal institutional belongings against a universal exercise of reason. So the task of the public use of reason was not to answer questions and solve problems, but to redefine the very grounds of problems, to ask about the horizon of meaning which is always already there, structuring our approach to reality, and of which we are generally unaware. So while the private use of reason is something that Kant describes as anything done as part of a certain mechanism, a civil post, a school, in a society of clergymen, in the army, in order for a subject to practice a public use of reason, they must transcend this particular position. A clergyman who is critical of the system of the church can address the world as a scholar, or a citizen who is critical of the taxation system can critique it from the position of a scholar. And the same goes for any other subject position in the apparatus of the social order. So Kant explains, and this is a quote from him, I don't think it's on I think it's in the handout. The touchstone of everything that can be concluded as a law for a people lies in the question, this is Kant, could a people have imposed such a law upon itself? And even if a people have instituted some law upon itself, law is always instituted for a brief time to introduce order and an expectation of what is better. So men work themselves bit by bit out of immaturity and at different paces. Not everybody is able to adhere to the public use of reason. Thus, enlightenment is a qualitative transformation. not a quantitative one. So the task of enlightenment is infinite, and humankind are perplexing creatures, finite, restricted to certain mechanisms. There's a dual role that subjects must play. They must both be passive, as machines following the natural law, and active, as ethical political subjects. So this kind of split nature of the modern subject seems to be the very grounds of their freedom. Karl Marx takes Kant's categorical imperative, or the imperative to act, in a way in which the highest aim for man is man himself, or woman herself, and extends it in his own critique of capitalist political economy. He says, this is Marx, who you will not be reading in this course. The criticism of religion, begun with Kant, ends with the teaching that man is the highest being for man, hence with the categorical imperative to overthrow all relations in which man is debased, enslaved, forsaken, and despicable being. So the plight of the modern subject, as Kant seems to be saying in this text, is precisely this. They must obey the commands of social and political institutions, and in this obedience there is essentially no freedom. In here, it's important to note the stark contrast with figures like Adam Smith and Thomas Hobbes, that while for these thinkers they presume the pursuit of self-interest to be the core of enlightened society, Kant seems to argue that it is this very self-interest that paradoxically limits freedom. So the paradox for Kant is that, and I quote him here, a high degree of civic freedom appears advantageous for spiritual freedom, even if it places restrictions on it. And a low degree of civil freedom, of argue as much as you want but obey, seems to create the room for spiritual freedom to spread its full capacity, end of quote. Now, spiritual freedom for Kant is not equivalent to free thinking, and civic freedom does not appear to be conducive to free thinking, to true enlightenment. Frederick the Great may be a model prince, the 18th century may be in true need for some degree of spiritual freedom, but remember, it does not represent an enlightened age, but a potential for enlightenment that has to be actualized and not restricted to a form of religious freedom and an enlightened monarch only. So neither spiritual freedom nor freedom induced by government are forms of true enlightenment, in which the public use of reason may question all laws that were already given. So for Kant, the very idea that everything is determined by natural cause is made possible by the position that brackets freedom. And conversely, only when determination by natural cause is bracketed can the very idea of freedom intervene. So the key is that one can never explain everything from one and the same positionality. One should always seek a certain universality. And universality is not simply a coalition of common senses, but has to go against plural common senses while also taking others into consideration. So in a sense, the Enlightenment represented this unprecedented political venture to replace belief in authority as the basis of polity with human reason and knowledge. So we can conclude perhaps with a young Hegel, whom you will come to towards the end of the course, who described the modern subject not as the light of the modern Enlightenment, but this night, this empty nothing, the uncanny Frankenstein that we can't get rid of by reducing it to any positive content. Okay, thank you. That's it.